Hello and welcome to the Election Corner on One Man Think Tank. Today we're going to be going over the AARP poll that was released on September 10th, 2020 for basically the first week of September. We'll get into the details in a moment, but the reason why this poll is interesting and why you really should be paying attention to it is because it's one of the few polls of 50 plus voters. Historically, there's a good reason for why they're the only ones who do these polls. One, they're the AARP, and two, 50 plus voters are usually a pretty boring demographic to pay attention to, but if there's a shift, it's a big shift. Now, they didn't do every single state. While they did poll both the 2020 presidential election and the 2020 Senate election, they only polled 11 states: Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Georgia, Iowa, Maine, Michigan, Montana, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Now, these 11 states are the toss-ups for the election. Like, if you are using the broadest definition, they're here, and I'm going to give AARP a lot of credit. They didn't do any of the nonsense where it's like, well, Minnesota, that could be a toss-up, or I was hearing Ohio, that could be in the toss-up category. Didn't Biden get within 5 points in one poll there? None of that stuff. It is just the nitty-gritty details. The one state I would have liked to see on here, if I'm being picky, would have been, in my opinion, Kansas, but I understand why it wasn't included. The presidential race there is pretty much locked up for Donald Trump. So, these are your 11 states. Now, let's take a look at their actual methodology by scrolling down. And as you can see, they did 5 states: Colorado, Georgia, Iowa, Maine, Montana, using the firms of Fabrizio, Ward, and Hart Research. And they did telephone interviews. So keep in mind, people had to pick up the phone. There was no online stuff. And usually if it's online, it tends to bias either pretty heavily one way, usually more left-leaning. But they also intentionally oversampled 50 plus voters. And 800 is a good number to sample. This is a good sample size, and they only did likely voters. Apparently their margin of error varied, but the max is plus or minus 4, which is a little bit collar pulling for me. But overall, I'm guessing that's at the most extreme. So in practice, I'm guessing we can assume it's about 3 points per each. Now, they also did their remaining states using Benson Strategy Group and GS Strategy Group, and they surveyed almost twice the people there, but keep in mind they also surveyed an additional state, which doesn't exactly explain away the difference, but they did survey quite a few people. And they also surveyed for a slightly longer time, so they have a lower margin of error of roughly the high 2.5 to 2.8%. We'll round that up to 3, so assume a 3-point margin of error on all of these, even if it's a bit off. You can find this poll for yourself on AARP's website, so if you want to view it more, be my guest. I highly recommend you do it yourself if you want to get into the deep details. But starting off with this infographic at the top, we have the real meats and potatoes, the true battlegrounds of the presidential election, and they are Arizona, Florida, Michigan, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. Now, Biden just needs to, in practice, win 3 of these and he wins the election. We can assume basically every other state they're doing, it's a toss-up, but Biden doesn't need to win any of these. Trump needs to win okay, so Biden needs to win Colorado. He's kind of expected to win there. But the rest of these states, except for Montana, are kind of toss-ups. And Maine. I keep adding things. So Colorado, Maine, and Montana, a little bit less toss-uppy for the presidential election, but where we can basically guess Trump wins Montana, Biden wins Maine and Colorado, but we'll get to them in a moment. Now, as you can see, Biden and Trump are in a statistical tie in North Carolina. Well, Trump is in the lead in Florida, while Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan show Biden ahead outside the margin of error. Keep in mind, even Trump's victory in Florida is at the very edge of that 3-point margin of error, which could tie him. And here's why these numbers are horrible for the Republican Party. In 2 words, age 50 plus. 3 words, age 50 plus. Because guess what? Younger voters always vote more Democratic. At the end of the day, if you take the under 50 cohort, it is going to vote more Democratic. So, if we assume these numbers are accurate and we don't go even margin of error, let's go extreme with the margin of error and assume it's all in favor of Trump. We have 3 states. Biden wins with 50 plus, basically guaranteeing his victory in the presidential election, because he just needs to win these 3. In my presidential election prediction videos, go check those out if you haven't, I have been on the record saying that I am now under the opinion Hillary Clinton lost Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan because she was Hillary Clinton, not because they're getting more Republican. Meanwhile, Arizona and North Carolina, let's give it to Trump. He gets 3 points in his favor. Are we assuming that we're going to have near ties in the youth voter turnout in states like Arizona and North Carolina, where there is massive support for the Democrats at the Senate level and in North Carolina, the gubernatorial level, for their races? Are we assuming those won't have coattails? These are horrible numbers. For the Republicans, age 50 plus has been their bulwark. That's the thing that keeps them afloat in these states. That's the thing that keeps them going. That's why they get so freaked out whenever why they get freaked out when new immigrants move in, because, especially young immigrants, because they will vote against the Republicans. The only one that's at all good news for Trump is Florida, and Biden doesn't need to win Florida to win. And there's no Senate race there, so it's not like the Democrats are losing a Senate seat there to the Republicans that they could easily win again. But there you have it. These are horrible numbers for the Republicans here. If these numbers are true, Trump's lost the presidential election. He doesn't have a chance of winning. Continuing down, as you can see, they basically repeat what I've said here, but we do get a small so we get some of their general numbers here. So in Pennsylvania, amongst all voters, Trump is losing by 4 points, but actually in over 50 plus, Biden has gained a percentage point, which is what I call a margin of error statistic, where they're basically the same number. So the fact Trump is perfectly 4 points below Biden is bad news for him. While in Florida, amongst all voters, Biden's actually leading by 2 points, while Trump is still leading amongst 50 plus. So that's another bad number, and that's that, like what I said, there's a shift that occurs once you add in younger voters, because they now outnumber over 50s, and if the over 50s are more liberal in how they vote, even if it's just one election, that costs the Republicans a bunch. That is their bulwark. They need over 50s to be like, only 30% are voting Democrat, while 66 come out, or 70% come out in favor of the Republicans every single time. It's that classic case of how Obama won Iowa. He didn't win Iowa by being really good in Des Moines and Cedar Rapids. He won Iowa by going to every rural district he could find in the state and shrinking his margin of loss. By doing that, he won Iowa, because there were less people overall voting for the Republicans, which gave the Democrats the slight advantage they needed. And looking at North Carolina, we're seeing a tie here. These numbers are pretty accurate for what we've been seeing out of North Carolina for the presidential election. Biden's gained slightly, but he's not taken the lead. We are still 2 months out, so there's room for that to change. But overall, North Carolina is one of those almost pure toss-up states. I think it's slightly in Biden's favor, given how much he's gaining, but plus the other 2 races. But I'll save predictions for the election videos. And we get the only states that have massive leads. Trump's only lead is an 8-point lead in Montana, or 7-point lead in Montana, which is really bad for him. He should be winning at least Montana by double digits. You would expect him to have a pretty large lead in Georgia, but I understand he doesn't have that either. While Biden has double-digit leads in Colorado and Maine. This is why I think these states were included for their Senate races, but I don't think Colorado should be included at this point. It's basically a guaranteed flip for the Democrats in the Senate race, and Democrats won it in 2016. There's no reason to believe they won't in 2020. We'll skip the coronavirus stuff. It's basically as you'd expect. But the real interesting thing here next is the absentee and early voting and the postal system. So as you can see, in Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, and Michigan, over 50 voters are saying overwhelmingly they're going to vote for either by absentee ballot or by early voting. Those are horrible numbers for the Republicans because, as you know, they've been sabotaging the Postal Service. We'll get to this in just a moment. I'm just being honest with you. They have been. However, while they've been sabotaging blue states, they've been vastly more successful at sabotaging red states because the red state goes along with it. However, look at these states. Arizona, Florida, North Carolina, and Michigan, but the biggest ones are those those three. Oh, look, Arizona, North Carolina, and Florida. In Michigan, Trump's so behind, I don't think what I'm about to say doesn't apply to it. These three states, overwhelmingly Republican. And if they are going at that are looking real close, and if they go out of their way to block early voting, it looks like they're going to be hurting their strongest base. Like in Florida, we saw he's leading in Florida but losing with the general population. 61% of 50 plus. If they show up and their ballots get lost in the mail, because I'm willing to bet enthusiasm is slightly higher for Republicans in Florida in this poll than Democrats, just knowing Florida, and they lose a good chunk of them, that could very well cost them that could very well cost them Florida because they burned their own ballots in an attempt to keep the Democrats from voting. And to continue this, there are strong concerns about the Postal Service in Colorado, Georgia, Iowa, Maine, and Montana. I believe this is in everyone, not 50 plus. And here is where it's why it should be scary to the not for the Democrats, to the government for this. Because it means if Trump wins by slim margins, especially if it's in these states, that's going to make him look really, really illegitimate. Now, I don't think he's personally worried about that, but that's how you get to recounts and you don't have federal recall elections here, but that you could find yourself with people trying, and the less people believe your win was legitimate, the less power you have. That's just a fact of the matter. You don't have a divine mandate, and what's really bad for the Republicans is, looking at how 2020 went, their attempts to sabotage this election have been really bad. They are, by definition, the last gasps of a voter suppression empire that is slowly crumbling as Democrats take more and more state houses and reverse the gerrymandering. Once they have the magical 270 electoral votes, ungerrymandered, unclear, all cleared for voter turnout, Republicans can't win the presidency again. They're probably not going to be able to win the Senate again. And given what I was saying is, given their piss-poor attempts to sabotage this election, we're having an election in 2020, even if Republicans win. And that's where all the bad news starts coming in, because if this year doesn't just favor the Democrats in the Senate, next year definitely will. And that's how you end up with George W. Bush levels of Democrats being elected to office. And, frankly, a lot of them are probably going to be more progressive and disliking of the government, disliking of the current presidency and Senate than they are right now. Now we go to the fun one, which is the Senate. The Senate's so contentious, it's so interesting. I love talking about the Senate. And here's what we have. They have keyed in on some of the closest races, and in my opinion, they've done all of the big toss-up races, except they included Colorado for some reason, and this poll just proves why. Now, this is amongst all voters, so keep this in mind. This is not amongst 50 plus, so we can't do any of the, well, let's pay attention. But keep in mind, a lot of this was landline, so it will skew older for Georgia, Colorado, Iowa, Maine, and Montana, which means over half of these races were done by landline and intentionally oversampled 50 plus voters. So keep that in mind. So you can assume this may actually skew a bit more Democratic than it is. So it's biased Republican is what I'm saying. So first off, we have Arizona, where Mark Kelly is still trouncing Martha McSally. He has won every single poll I have seen except for, I think he even won the Trafalgar Group poll, which is saying something because I posted video on them, I think, a few days ago. And they have some pretty serious bias attached to them. So these are awful numbers for Martha McSally. In Colorado, more proof that I don't know why it was here. I think people have this idea because there's a Republican incumbent. Somehow the Democrats are going to, like, it's hard for the Democrats to win. It's a bright blue state now, using the popular governor, Hickenlooper, against very unpopular Cory Gardner. Cory Gardner has not broken 40, up into the high 40s in forever, while Hickenlooper has polled really well. Once again, I think even Trafalgar Group was unable to get it so the Democrats were losing to the Republicans. In Georgia, here's where it gets interesting. Keep in mind, Georgia, 80% likely voters, oversampling 50 plus, telephone. This should be going Republican hardcore. Ossoff, the Democratic challenger, is leading by 1 point. Margin of error for days. But, and here's where it's important, this skews elderly, this skews Republican, and this is showing the Democrat in the lead. This means Georgia is a lot more contentious. It's its main election than people have thought it is. And frankly, by election day, we could be going, oh, Georgia, yeah, that's going blue. Which, not where you want to be, again, when you're a Republican. But you need to keep in mind there is significant voter suppression in Georgia, which could cost the Democrats the election. Speaking of costing the Democrats the election, however, this is more due to their own idiocy, in the Georgia special election jungle primary, it's looking like there's a solid chance there's going to be 2 Republicans in the runoff. However, Raphael Warnock does have 19 points, which is good for him, and 20% are undecided. However, knowing Georgia, there's a solid chance they could break to the Republicans. What they really need is for Matt Lieberman or Ed Tarver to drop out. However, due to reasons of ego and possibly being a plant, they're not going to. Joking about him being a plant, there's no real proof to that. I just saw a Twitter thread that said so. In Iowa, bad news if you're a Democrat in Iowa. Joni Ernst has 50 points. She is doing surprisingly well, I will admit. Like I said, skews Republican. She's the next state on this list to have that attachment, but those are big numbers. Theresa Greenfield is polling well, but she's constantly polling at the mid to high 40s, so 44 to 48%, while Joni Ernst is polling high to above 50%. So right now it's looking like this is just reinforcing the fact that Iowa really wants to be blue, but at its core is a Republican state. In Maine, we kind of have to throw out this one for one key reason. They polled including the independent Lisa Savage, which is fine. She polled at 6%. However, Maine has ranked choice voting for their Senate elections, meaning her votes, when she doesn't win, will transfer to one of these 2 candidates. And judging by other polls we've looked at, they're going to Gideon. So right now we're going to assume a 2/3 go to Gideon and 1/3 goes to Collins. Be fair here, despite the fact I think I'm being overly generous to Collins. And frankly, bad numbers for Collins. She should be doing well. Like, here's the other key factor. If you're an incumbent and you're losing at this point in the race, you need a miracle to come back from it. If you're a challenger and not doing amazing, okay, it's understandable, but man, we've got 4 Republican incumbents. Actually, we haven't even gotten to it, but 5 Republican incumbents doing poorly. That's a sign there's going to be some flips. Probably enough to flip the Senate. In Michigan, Gary Peters is polling at 45%, but, well, John James is at 41%. However, Gary Peters suffers from an issue of name recognition, even this late, and what we've seen is when these polls get done a second or third time, keeping in mind these polls are still biased towards Republicans ever so slightly, though the Michigan one is less, what we find is undecideds ended up going back to Gary Peters. And that's just how it goes. If I wouldn't put much stock in this poll and think, oh, Peters is in danger or John James is surging. These numbers are pretty typical of what we've seen. John James polling low 40s, Peters mid to high 40s to over 50%. In Montana, it continues the trend of Senator Steve Daines is exactly at 50%, while Bullock is in the high 40s. The key point here is Bullock is always in the high 40s, while Daines ranges from being low 40s to over 50%. There's no middle ground. And that says to me there's a lot of undecided voters who are figuring their shit out. And right now, keep in mind this bias is towards the elderly, but also Montana, so telephone interviews are a little bit better way to get an idea of the populace. We're looking at a tight election on election day. Steve Daines has the advantage, but it's going to be tight. And lastly, North Carolina, and these are great numbers for the Democrats. Cal Cunningham remains in the lead, while Tom Tillis can't even get past 40% of the vote. When compared with other polls from reputable outlets, such as, not to say AARP isn't reputable, but I'm saying these other pollsters also are reputable. We're talking mid-50s, high 50s, not mid-50s, mid-40s, high 40s, sometimes even over 50% for Cunningham. If Tillis was going to get a good poll, it was going to be this one, and he didn't. So overall, your takeaway from both the Senate races and the presidential races is this is a great poll for the Democrats, bad poll for the Republicans, and there's a solid chance the elderly vote will, for the first time in a long time, flip from Republican to Democrat in quite a few states. So if you like the video, click the like button down below and also drop a comment. I love hearing what you guys have to say. If you want more from the channel, click the subscribe button and the notification bell so you can be alerted when new content comes out. If you want to see more from me outside of YouTube, I do have a Twitter, which I will update at some point in the future, at OneManThinkTan1, the Roman numeral, link down in the description below. Otherwise, as always, and most importantly, have a wonderful day.